Have you seen images with the light trails from cars? Or you have seen the silk effect on fountains or rivers? And you want to create those images? Well, let's talk about long exposure photography. Today, in the studio. Hello everyone, my name is Alex Silva and today we're talking about long exposure photography. Well, let's start with defining what is long exposure photography. And it's super simple. It is photography created using long exposure times. Usually, in many cases in photography, exposure times are fractions of a second, let's say half a second, a quarter, 1/15, things like that. However, in long exposure photography, we usually start with 1 second to, let's say, 8 and even longer. And in some extreme cases, I have seen images created with exposures of 30 minutes or things like that. That is the main difference with long exposure. You get to the other side of the equation, you're not using fractions of a second, but complete seconds, even longer than 1 second. So that is long exposure photography. Now let's talk about your gear. What do you need in order to create long exposure photography? Well, it's super simple. It's very likely that you can use your current camera if you're using, let's say, a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, a super zoom, and probably even your cell phone, your smartphone. If you use an app that allows you to control the exposure times, you will be able to use your smartphones. And in any case, with any camera that you currently have, the thing that you need to be able to control is the exposure times. In only some cases, you may need something called an ND filter or neutral density filter. Another thing that you need in terms of gear is a tripod or some sort of support. Because you're going to use these long exposure times, any movement of the camera will show in the image. So you need to make sure that your camera is fixed in position for the time of the exposure. The main recommendation for this is to use a tripod, but of course you can use any other some form of support for your camera, whether it is your bag, a rock, a piece of furniture, whatever. You can use any other support as long as your camera stays fixed in place. So now we know about the gear. Let's talk about how we can create these images with long exposure times. Well, let's start with usually low ISO. Most cameras have a low ISO setting of 100, but if your camera has a low setting of 64, 50 or 32, use that. Then we're going to use time priority mode. In Canon cameras, you will see it as TV mode. In pretty much any other brand, you will see it as the S mode. And we're going to start with an exposure time of 1 second and see how that goes. The camera is going to calculate the corresponding aperture, and you will be able to see what goes on. And depending on the image that you want to create, you may want to play with longer exposure times. Let's say for light trails, I usually try and use 5 seconds. If I'm going to try with the silk effect on let's say a fountain or a river, I go a bit longer with 10-15 seconds. But it all depends on what you want to what kind of image that you want to create, and of course the capabilities of your camera. Now, this is the main, let's say, recipe or the main knowledge that you may need in order to create long exposure images. Now, however, don't stop there. Long exposure photography allows you to make very creative images. One particular thing that I really like to do with long exposures is light painting. When you mix your natural image and then you add some light using flashlights or things like that, in which you can actually write on the air using the flashlights, or you can paint your own light trails using these flashlights or sparklers or things like that. And of course, you can create an image with ghosts, in which people move around, but some portion of the image stays still. Make sure that you practice this, whether it is at dusk or at dawn. It's easier. Those are the main recommendations for long exposure photography. You shoot at dawn or dusk. Use a manual camera or a camera in time priority mode. Use tripod or some sort of support, and use low ISO. And get creative with it. There's the main recommendation that I can give you is that you go and practice it and start getting creative with it, and I'm pretty sure you will have a lot of fun. I really hope you like this video. If that is the case, just press the like button, and if you want to keep up to date with this channel, well, of course you can subscribe to it. But please remember to keep learning and keep shooting. See you next week.